The sun hung low over the quiet countryside, casting long shadows across the endless fields. It was the kind of place where time moved slow, where everyone knew each other, and where trouble rarely found its way. But today was different. Today, trouble had arrived in the form of 3 gang members, their bikes kicking up dust as they rode down the dirt road toward a lonely farmhouse. Inside the old wooden house, Henry sat in his worn-out chair, sharpening a knife with steady, practiced hands. He was a man of few words, a man who had seen more in his lifetime than most could imagine. His body bore the marks of years of hard labor, and his limp, something people often mistook as weakness, was the only visible reminder of a past he never spoke about. Most folks around town saw him as just another farmer, an aging man with a broken body, struggling to keep his land alive. But they didn't know the truth. The gang members, fresh off a string of petty crimes, had heard about Henry. They saw an easy target, a lonely, disabled farmer, living miles from anyone who could help him. A perfect mark for intimidation, maybe even a little fun. As they pulled up to the property, they smirked at the sight of him, moving slowly across the yard, feeding his chickens as if he hadn't noticed them. But Henry had noticed. He had heard their engines from a mile away. He had seen their kind before, and he knew exactly what they had come for. The leader of the group, a cocky young man covered in tattoos, stepped forward, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Nice place you got here, old man," he sneered. "Be a shame if something happened to it." His friends chuckled, kicking over a bucket of feed as they spread out, circling him like vultures. Henry simply looked at them, his expression unreadable. "You should leave," he said, his voice calm but firm. The gang laughed. One of them shoved Henry's shoulder, testing him. "Or what?" he mocked. Henry sighed, setting down the feed bucket. His fingers flexed slightly, the old instincts stirring. For years, he had buried that part of himself, convinced he would never need it again. But now, as he looked into the eyes of these men, he realized something. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Henry's grip tightened for just a second before he forced his hands to relax. He had spent years learning to control that part of himself, pushing it deep down where it couldn't hurt anyone. But these men, these reckless, foolish men, had no idea what they were waking up. The leader, still smirking, stepped even closer. "You deaf old man," he taunted. "We're talking to you." One of his friends leaned against Henry's fence, snapping a wooden post in half like it was nothing. Another kicked over a watering can, the water spilling onto the dry dirt. They weren't just trying to scare him. They wanted a reaction. They wanted him to beg. Henry didn't move. He just stared, his eyes cold and unreadable. A younger version of himself might have handled this differently. A younger version of himself might have already ended this. But that was a long time ago, and he had promised himself he'd never go back to that life. "What do you want?" Henry asked, his voice calm but edged with something that made the men hesitate, just for a second. The leader scoffed. "What do you think? Money, food. Maybe we just don't like the way you look. Doesn't matter, does it?" He gestured to the land. "All this space, no neighbors, nobody to come running if something bad happens to you. That's a problem, huh?" Henry exhaled slowly. "No," he said, "that's not a problem." The gang members exchanged glances. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right. There was no fear in his voice. No anger, no panic. Just certainty. It was like he knew something they didn't. The leader's grin faltered, but he covered it up with a laugh. "You're funny," he muttered. "Real funny." He turned to one of his guys. "Go check inside. See what this old man's got." The younger man smirked and started toward the house. Henry stepped forward, just a single step, but it was enough to make all 3 men stop. "You don't want to do that," Henry said. The young man hesitated. Something in Henry's voice made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was more like a warning, a final one. But the leader wasn't having it. He shoved Henry hard in the chest. "Or what, huh? What are you gonna do, old man?" Henry stumbled back slightly, catching himself against the porch railing. He looked down at the dirt, breathing in the air, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He had tried to be someone else. He had tried to leave it all behind. But if these men pushed him any further, they were going to find out exactly who he used to be. The air felt heavier now, thick with something the gang members didn't quite understand. The laughter had died down, replaced by a quiet tension that settled over the farm like a storm cloud. Henry lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting the leader's with a stare so steady, so unwavering, that for the first time, the younger man hesitated. The gang member closest to the house swallowed hard, but didn't stop moving. He grabbed the door handle, ready to push his way inside, but before he could, Henry spoke again. "I said, you don't want to do that." His voice was softer this time, almost tired, like a man who had warned others before and had seen what happened when they didn't listen. The young man hesitated again, his fingers tightening on the doorknob. The wood of the porch creaked beneath his boots, and for the first time, he noticed something strange. There were no other footprints leading to the door, no signs that Henry even went inside much. Something about that felt wrong. The leader of the group, impatient with the standoff, sneered, "Enough of this." He turned to Henry and gave him another hard shove. "You think you're tough, huh? Think we should be scared of some crippled farmer?" Henry didn't react, not at first, but there was something about the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers curled just slightly at his sides, that sent a ripple of unease through the group. It was a feeling they couldn't explain, like standing too close to the edge of a cliff, like realizing too late that the ice beneath their feet was cracking. One of the gang members, a wiry man with a scar along his cheek, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just take what we need and go," he muttered. "This place gives me the creeps." The leader shot him a look. "You scared of some old man?" He laughed, shaking his head. "You guys are pathetic." Henry watched, saying nothing. He could see it happening, the tiny fractures forming in their confidence, the first hints of doubt slipping in. He had seen this before years ago, in places far from here. Back then, he had been a different man. Back then, he had been the one breaking people down, one small piece at a time. The young man at the door clenched his jaw, trying to shake off the nerves, and pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, revealing the dim interior of Henry's house. The smell of old wood and something else, something faint but distinct, drifted out. He took a single step inside, and then he stopped. The house was mostly empty. No family photos, no decorations, no clutter. Just a wooden table, a single chair, and a heavy cabinet against the far wall. The kind of place a man lived in when he didn't expect visitors, or when he didn't want them. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. There was something about this house, about this whole situation, that didn't add up. He turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the walls, the floors, the corners of the room. And then, he saw it. Something small, something almost hidden. But once he noticed it, he couldn't unsee it. A deep scratch in the wooden floor. Several of them, actually. Long, jagged marks, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. Recently, his stomach twisted. He took a step back toward the door. And that was when Henry finally moved. Henry's steps were slow, deliberate, barely making a sound against the dirt. His eyes never left the man standing in his doorway. The gang member swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his sides. Something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his gut. The house, the way Henry carried himself, the way he didn't flinch or argue or beg. This wasn't how people reacted when they were scared. The leader, still grinning, had no idea. "Oh, what? You finally gonna do something, old man?" he taunted, stepping closer. "Go ahead. Give me a reason." Henry didn't answer. His gaze flicked once, just for a fraction of a second, toward the man inside the house. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but the guy at the door caught it. His pulse quickened. He turned his head slightly, scanning the room again, his brain catching up to something he had missed before. The deep scratches in the floor weren't random. They formed a pattern, leading toward the heavy cabinet against the far wall. The air inside the house suddenly felt colder. Something was behind that cabinet. His breathing shallowed. He knew he should leave, just turn around, step back onto the porch, act like he didn't see anything. But his feet wouldn't move. Henry exhaled slowly, his face unreadable. "I told you," he said, almost like he regretted it. "You don't want to be here." The gang leader, oblivious, shoved Henry again. "Quit talking in riddles and start acting like a man, old-timer." Henry barely reacted. The man inside the house, though, wasn't listening anymore. He took another step, closer to the cabinet. His hand reached out, fingers brushing the wooden edge. The dust pattern around its base was uneven. It had been moved. Recently. His stomach turned. He reached out to pull it open. And Henry moved. Not a limp, not a slow shuffle, but something fast, unnaturally fast for a man his age. Before anyone could react, he had the gang leader's wrist in a grip like iron, twisting just enough to send the younger man stumbling. The other two barely had time to register what happened before Henry turned his head slightly, his eyes dark and sharp. "You really should have listened," he murmured. The man inside the house yanked the cabinet. It scraped against the floor, revealing. His breath hitched. The leader, cursing, tried to break free from Henry's grip, but the older man wasn't letting go. The gang member inside the house stumbled back, his face pale, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. That was when the first real spark of fear hit. And by then, it was too late. The gang member inside the house stumbled back so fast, he nearly tripped over his own feet. His chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths, his eyes locked on what had been hidden behind the cabinet. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The others outside saw his reaction before they saw what he had seen. The leader, still struggling against Henry's grip, twisted his head toward the open doorway. His frustration shifted to confusion, then something colder when he noticed the color draining from his friend's face. "What?" he snapped. "What's in there?" The man inside didn't answer. His hands trembled slightly, his whole body stiff as if frozen in place. Henry's grip on the leader's wrist tightened just enough to stop him from pulling away. "I told you not to open it," Henry said, his voice quieter now, almost disappointed. The gang member inside finally found his voice, but it was barely more than a whisper. "What the hell is this?" The leader yanked hard, finally breaking free from Henry's grasp, and pushed past him toward the door. The last gang member followed, peering inside cautiously. Their boots creaked on the porch, their eyes adjusting to the dim light as they took in the scene. And then they saw it. At first, it didn't make sense. It looked like a workshop, an old hidden space filled with things that shouldn't have been there. Tools, thick chains, reinforced wooden panels along the walls. A heavy, scratched-up table sat in the center, its surface worn from years of use. There were no windows, no decorations, no signs of a normal life. Just cold, functional precision. The leader's bravado faltered. His mind scrambled for an explanation, for anything that made this less disturbing than it was. What is this place?" Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past them, toward the open doorway, as if remembering something far away. "It used to be necessary," he said at last. "A long time ago." The words sent a chill through the gang members. The youngest one, the one who had first stepped inside, shook his head. This isn't right, man. This isn't normal." Henry's eyes darkened. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The gang leader swallowed hard. The room, the heavy silence, the way Henry stood there without a hint of fear. It was all wrong. And then, just as the realization started to settle in, Henry took another step forward. "You think I live all the way out here because I'm weak?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the air feel thicker. "You think I'm alone because I don't have a choice?" Nobody answered. Henry let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment sink into their bones. Then he exhaled slowly. You came here thinking I was an easy target. His eyes locked onto the leader's, steady and unblinking. You never once thought about why no one else does. The words settled like a stone in their stomachs. And just as the leader opened his mouth, just as he started to realize they had made a mistake far greater than they understood, Henry reached behind him and locked the door. The sharp click of the lock echoed through the small house, louder than it should have been. The gang members froze. The leader's cocky smirk was gone now, replaced by something else, something that edged dangerously close to fear. He turned slowly, his eyes darting between Henry and the closed door. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, forcing his voice to stay steady. Henry didn't answer right away. He reached for the chair at the table, dragging it forward with the ease of a man who had done this before. He sat down slowly, lacing his fingers together, and finally looked up at them. "You came here," he said, voice calm, measured. "You thought I was just some old man, just some broken farmer." His gaze flicked to the youngest gang member, the one still standing near the hidden workshop, eyes wide with realization. "But now you are starting to understand, aren't you?" The youngest one took a shaky step back, his foot scuffing against the floor. We don't want any trouble, man," he stammered. Henry tilted his head slightly. "That's funny," he said, "because a few minutes ago, that's exactly what you wanted." The leader clenched his fists, trying to regain control. "This some kind of sick joke," he snapped. "You think locking us in here is gonna scare us?" He stepped forward. "Let me tell you something, old man." Henry stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move fast. But the second he rose to his full height, the room felt smaller. The weight of something unspoken pressed down on the gang members, something they didn't have a name for, but could feel in their bones. "You should have left when I told you to," Henry said quietly. The leader hesitated. He didn't want to admit it, but there was something in Henry's eyes that made his throat go dry. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Henry reached down and pulled open a small drawer in the table. The gang members tensed, expecting a weapon, but instead, he pulled out something else. An old weathered badge. The leader's expression twisted in confusion. "What is that?" Henry turned it in his fingers, letting the dim light catch the edges. "A reminder," he said, "of who I used to be." The youngest gang member sucked in a breath. "You were?" Henry nodded once. "A hunter," he said simply, "of men." The words settled in the air like a final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The scars, the limp, the cold precision in his eyes, it all made sense now. He hadn't just been some ex-cop. He had been something else. Someone sent to find the worst kind of people. Someone who never left a job unfinished. And now, 3 more men stood in his home, realizing too late that they had just walked into the last place they ever should have been. The leader swallowed hard, trying to shake off the creeping dread. "Look," he said, raising his hands slightly. We make a mistake, all right. We'll leave. We'll walk out that door, and we won't come back." Henry studied him for a long moment. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he reached into his pocket. The gang members tensed, until he pulled out a small key. He turned, unlocked the door, and stepped aside. "Go," he said. They didn't hesitate. The youngest one bolted first, practically falling over himself to get outside. The scarred man followed, his face pale, his breath short. The leader, the last one out, turned at the door, his pride still fighting against his fear. "If we see you again." Henry's expression didn't change. He just took a single step closer. The leader flinched. Henry didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The gang leader swallowed whatever threat he was about to make and hurried after the others. Their bikes rolled to life seconds later, tires spitting gravel as they tore down the road, disappearing into the distance. Henry stood in the doorway, watching the dust settle. The house was quiet again, peaceful. He exhaled slowly, then turned back to the open drawer. His fingers brushed over the old badge one last time before he closed it. Some things were better left in the past. But tonight had been a reminder. Some people had to learn the hard way, or they should stay far, far away. Henry stood in the doorway for a long time, listening as the sound of the gang's motorcycles faded into the night. The road stretched empty again, just the way he liked it. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders as he stepped back inside. The house felt different now, quieter in a way that wasn't just about sound. He moved to the old wooden table, fingers tracing the edge before pulling out the chair and sinking into it. His gaze fell to the drawer he had just closed, the weight of his past still lingering in the air. He had spent years trying to leave it behind, to bury the man he once was under simple routines, planting, repairing fences, tending to the land. But tonight had reminded him of something important. No matter how much he tried to disappear, the world had a way of finding him. The farm, the quiet, the isolation, it had never been about fear or weakness. It had been a choice. A way to keep others safe. A way to keep himself from slipping back into what he used to be. But men like those who showed up tonight didn't understand choices like that. They saw silence as submission, age as weakness. They had no idea what it really meant to survive. Henry pushed back the chair, standing once more. He moved toward the cabinet, the one the gang had been so eager to uncover, and dragged it back into place. The scratches on the floor would stay, a small reminder of what happened here. He glanced around the house, taking in the worn wood, the simple furniture, the life he had built. It was enough. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling through the fields. The night stretched on, dark and endless, but Henry didn't mind. He had lived through worse. He would wake up tomorrow and do what he always did, work the land, keep to himself, and let the world keep moving without him. As he reached for the lantern to dim the light, his gaze flicked toward the door one last time. The road was still empty, just as it should be. He had no doubt that those men wouldn't be coming back, and if they did, well, they knew now. Some places weren't meant to be disturbed, some men weren't meant to be tested. And Henry, he was just a farmer. At least, that's what he kept telling himself.